In a shocking reversal, American infrastructure is now being built with Canadian steel. What happened to Buy Americans?
Ports, railroads, power lines. In 2005, it's not U.S. steel getting the job done, it's Canada's.
You've heard about wheat. You've seen it with oil. But now, something even heavier is shifting steel. For decades, U.S. steel mills stood as the spine of global construction. From skyscrapers to submarines, the world turned to American steel. But in 2025, that spine started to bend. Not from collapse, but from competition. And while Washington focused on sanctions and tariffs, Canada made something else agreements. 7 countries across 3 continents now source their critical steel from Canada. Why? Lower emissions, fewer political strings, and most importantly, trust. But wait until you see who the 7th country is. Because that one changes everything. Number 1, South Africa. In early 2025, South Africa's Department of Infrastructure made a quiet but bold move. A major public works contract worth over $1.1 billion USD was awarded to a coalition of domestic firms, with one big condition: all structural steel must come from Canada. It was a break from decades of tradition. Historically, U.S. steel, especially from firms in Pennsylvania and Ohio, dominated South Africa's procurement lists. American steel was viewed as high-grade, dependable, and politically aligned. But the ground had already begun to shift. In 2024, new U.S. export tariffs raised steel prices by up to 17% for African partners. And South African contractors began complaining. Delivery delays, unpredictable customs checks, and pressure from Washington to align infrastructure with foreign policy. It wasn't just about money, it was about sovereignty. Meanwhile, Canada entered the scene quietly, with what local officials described as a handshake, not a hammer. The Canadian Steel Alliance, a public-private consortium, opened a trade mission in Johannesburg. They offered transparent pricing, guaranteed delivery schedules, and perhaps most importantly, compliance with South Africa's new green procurement law. You see, South Africa had just passed a major environmental regulation. All government-funded projects must use low-carbon materials. Canada's steel, produced in facilities powered largely by hydroelectricity and with lower emissions per ton than nearly any other country in the G20, fit perfectly. So when it came time to choose between U.S. steel that was slightly cheaper but dirtier and Canadian steel that met every requirement, officials made their move. What started as a single contract expanded quickly. By May 2025, 3 separate provinces had amended their procurement codes to prioritize Canadian steel. Canadian cargo ships began docking regularly at Durban and Cape Town. Even private developers in Sandton and Pretoria began following suit, citing consistency and cleaner sourcing. American diplomats protested quietly behind closed doors. But there was little they could say publicly. This wasn't a betrayal. This wasn't political. It was a business decision. A decision that quietly signaled to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa that there's a new, reliable partner in the steel game. Number 2, Thailand. When Bangkok announced its new Eastern Economic Corridor expansion in February 2025, most analysts assumed the U.S. would once again be the primary steel supplier. After all, American firms had played a major role in Thailand's high-speed rail and port modernization projects throughout the 2010 second and early 2020 second. But something shifted. This time, the contracts looked north to Canada. Specifically, the Thai Ministry of Industry signed a multi-year steel supply agreement with Nova Steel and Dominion Metal, 2 major Canadian producers. The deal covered more than 180,000 metric tons of structural and reinforced steel destined for bridges, tunnels, and manufacturing parks across the corridor. Why the change? The answer lies in 3 words: environmental, political, and delivery. First, Thailand has pledged to become carbon neutral by 2050. New construction rules require imported materials to come with detailed carbon audits. American firms caught up in political debates and regulatory backlogs failed to provide full environmental transparency in time. Canada, on the other hand, sent delegations early, conducted third-party carbon assessments, and offered clear guarantees on green production practices. Second, Thailand wanted political predictability, with the U.S. increasing its focus on Indo-Pacific defense and economic competition with China. Thai officials were wary of becoming collateral in another great power tug-of-war. Canadian trade officials arrived without demands. No lectures, no strings, just supply chain cooperation. Third, delivery timelines. Due to labor strikes at two major U.S. ports in late 2024, American steel deliveries to Southeast Asia had seen massive delays. Several Thai developers reported materials arriving 6 to 8 weeks late. Canadian exporters using western port routes through Vancouver and Prince Rupert maintained punctual shipping, delivering to Lame Shabang with less than a 2-day average delay. This reliability gave them an edge. By April, Thai media were reporting the shift. A headline in the Bangkok Post read, "Canada's quiet takeover of Thailand's steel market." And while U.S. embassies scrambled to respond, the steel had already arrived. The foundations were already poured. The cranes were already moving. In the words of one Thai infrastructure minister, Canada didn't come with noise. They just came on time. Number 3. Colombia. In March 2025, a surprising announcement came out of Bogota. The Colombian Ministry of Defense awarded a major infrastructure overhaul contract valued at over $800 million USD for the reconstruction of key military installations in Cartagena, Cali, and Bogota. But the real headline? All steel for the project would come from Canada. For years, Colombia had leaned heavily on American defense partnerships, not just in security, but also in infrastructure. U.S. steel had long been the default choice for military-grade construction due to its strength certifications and NATO-aligned standards. But by 2025, Colombia's calculus had changed. 3 factors drove the shift. 1. Stability of supply. U.S. steel shipments to Colombia had been plagued by disruptions due to a combination of rising costs from newly imposed export compliance checks, delays at U.S. Gulf ports due to extreme weather events, and a tightening of military export standards that slowed paperwork to a crawl. By contrast, Canadian suppliers offered direct-to-port delivery to Cartagena through the Panama route, with a 21-day shipping window and minimal red tape. 2. Political neutrality. Colombia had begun recalibrating its foreign policy, still allied with the U.S., but increasingly wary of being seen as overly dependent. The Canadian proposal aligned perfectly with Colombia's goals. No demands for joint bases, no security provisions hidden in the trade deal, and no political statements required for materials access. It was steel, not strings. 3. Emissions reporting. Even military-grade contracts in Colombia now require environmental transparency. A new federal law passed in late 2024 mandated all government contractors submit life-cycle carbon data. U.S. producers cited national security exemptions. Canadian firms? They published open-access carbon reports on every shipment. So when it came down to the final decision, Colombian officials said the choice was easy. And by mid-April, flatbed trucks bearing Canadian steel began crossing the Andes. More interestingly, civilian infrastructure started following suit. Within months, 3 large public-private highway projects announced that they too would source steel from Canada, citing cost stability and faster delivery. By the time Washington sent a trade envoy to discuss the situation, half the steel had already been installed. And the message was clear. It's not about abandoning the U.S., it's about trusting someone else to deliver. Number 4. In May 2025, as Manila prepared to break ground on its largest coastal defense project in 2 decades, an unexpected press release came from the Department of Public Works and Highways. Canada, not the United States, would be supplying the steel. The project, a chain of naval bases, storm barriers, and port upgrades across Luzon and the Visayas, is a linchpin in the Philippines' defense modernization and climate resilience plan. The scale is massive, 600,000 metric tons of reinforced steel over 3 years. It was widely assumed that U.S. contractors, with their long history in the region, would dominate the supply chain. But that assumption overlooked a simple reality. Filipino engineers didn't want politics. They wanted steel. And the U.S., in this case, came with too much baggage. In early 2025, Philippine lawmakers had voiced frustration over delays tied to U.S. congressional export approvals, some of which required months of back and forth on national interest clauses. In contrast, Canadian steelmakers offered a clear carbon audit system, fully insured deliveries through the Pacific Corridor, and most importantly, a firm delivery guarantee, even during typhoon season. Canada's Pacific shipping route, bolstered by a new logistics agreement with Japan and South Korea, allowed steel to move efficiently across the North Pacific, skipping many of the choke points that slowed U.S. shipments. But it wasn't just logistics. The deciding factor was trust. In a public address, Secretary Manuel Bonoan of the Department of Public Works and Highways said, "We've worked with both countries, but in this case, it was Canada that came with timelines, not talking points." He wasn't alone. By mid-June, 3 private Filipino developers followed suit, shifting supply contracts for residential and commercial projects in Metro Manila to Canadian steel providers. Local media began calling it the quiet reinforcement, and the numbers backed it up. In just 4 months, Philippine imports of Canadian steel had tripled, while U.S. shipments dropped 48%. Some American diplomats called it a temporary correction. But the groundwork, both literal and diplomatic, was already being laid. And every ton of Canadian rebar poured into Philippine soil told a deeper story. Sometimes, trust is measured in tons. Number 5. France. Paris doesn't move fast, but when it does, the world pays attention. In July 2025, the French government finalized a 1.2 billion euros modernization package for its national rail system. The project includes bridge reinforcement, urban transit upgrades, and high-speed rail maintenance. The biggest surprise? The majority of structural steel would come from Canada, not Germany, not the US, but across the Atlantic. It was a quiet deal, but a profound one. For decades, France maintained a continental-first approach when sourcing critical materials, relying on EU partners or domestic suppliers whenever possible. Occasionally, American suppliers filled the gap, especially on high-tensile alloys used in aerospace and heavy infrastructure. But after a string of disputes between Washington and Brussels centered on digital taxes, defense contracts, and climate rules, France began rethinking its supply relationships. And that's where Canada stepped in. What tilted the scales? 1. Emissions transparency. The European Union's 2024 Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism penalizes imports with high embedded emissions. U.S. steelmakers protested the rule, calling it unfair and political. Canadian firms? They embraced it. In fact, 2 of Canada's leading producers had already adopted EU-style carbon reporting before it became mandatory. 2. Labor and safety standards. Canadian steel plants passed every European inspection. French union leaders praised Canada's worker protections, saying they aligned better with France's own labor values than U.S. practices. 3. Logistics alignment. Canadian shipments into Le Havre and Marseille now benefit from the North Atlantic Green Corridor Initiative, launched jointly with EU regulators to decarbonize shipping lanes. That meant France could import steel without blowing its climate budget. By the time the contract was signed, Canadian suppliers had already staged material at staging yards near Bordeaux. But this wasn't just a trade deal, it was a cultural signal. When asked why Canada won the contract, France's Minister of Ecological Transition responded bluntly, because they listened. They didn't pressure, they just delivered. The shift was subtle but symbolic. Not because France rejected the US, but because Canada didn't make them choose. Number 6. Saudi Arabia. In the desert heat of Neom, the $500 billion futuristic megacity rising from Saudi Arabia's northwest. A quiet decision rippled through global markets. Canadian steel would be used in the core support structures of the Line, Oxagon, and the Trojana ski resort. For a kingdom that once saw American firms as default partners in steel, energy, and logistics, this was nothing short of a seismic shift. The reasons? Not dramatic, just practical. U.S. suppliers had grown complicated. Years of political friction, accusations of human rights hypocrisy, and shifting sanctions frameworks made American involvement in major Saudi infrastructure projects increasingly unpredictable. In contrast, Canada played the long game. For over a decade, Canadian trade envoys, engineers, and investment firms had laid groundwork through quieter, more consistent channels. When the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund invited global bids for Phase 4 of NEOM's steel contracts, two names rose to the top: ArcelorMittal Europe and Algoma Steel Canada. Algoma didn't win with low prices. They won with low-emission electric arc furnace credentials, a full partnership model including on-site Canadian engineers, a no-controversy international track record. In the words of one NEOM procurement officer, "We've dealt with Europe's regulations. We've dealt with America's unpredictability." Canada offered something neither did: silence and certainty. By July 2025, satellite images showed freighters carrying labeled Algoma containers docking at Red Sea ports. Meanwhile, Canadian engineering firms began sending workers to NEOM under bilateral worker mobility pacts signed in early 2024. Back in Washington, the decision didn't go unnoticed. Trade analysts warned that if Riyadh was comfortable sidelining U.S. steel in its most high-profile project ever, what other shifts might follow? It's not that America was replaced outright. It was simply left out. And that silence? It echoes louder than any announcement. Number 7. The United States. Yes, you read that right. In one of the most ironic twists of 2025, Canadian steel is now propping up parts of the U.S. economy that American steel itself can no longer fully support. It started small, just a few contracts. Then, it snowballed. Example? The Port of Seattle signed a $300 million upgrade contract in May 2025 for expanded loading facilities and container bridges. One key clause: the steel must meet new environmental benchmarks set by Washington State's Clean Infrastructure Act. American suppliers? They balked. Too costly, too fast, too rigid. Canada met the mark. Soon after, New York's Hudson Rail Tunnel extension, part of the Gateway Project, put out its own tender. Canadian bidders showed up not just with competitive steel, but with ready-made compliance packages that matched both state and federal decarbonization goals. By July 2025, Canadian steel had appeared in East Coast commuter bridges, Midwestern renewable energy pylons, West Coast transit hubs. But how did it come to this? 3 key shifts. 1. Policy disruption. Tariff instability under multiple U.S. administrations led to chaotic pricing. Canadian suppliers, operating under long-term agreements, were immune to the swing. 2. Labor bottlenecks. U.S. mills, many still struggling post-COVID, faced chronic staffing issues. Production fell behind. Deadlines slipped. 3. Green steel mandates. State-led climate laws began to demand cleaner steel. Canada, already leaning into electric arc furnaces and low-carbon output, became a natural solution. What once would have been unthinkable, a U.S. port using foreign steel, became routine. And the kicker? In some states, governors welcomed it. "We didn't go looking for foreign suppliers," said one Pennsylvania transit official. "We went looking for steel that actually showed up on time, within budget, and under carbon limits. Canada just did it." It's not just a loss of contracts. It's a loss of narrative. For decades, Buy American was a patriotic mantra. Now, some American projects are quietly buying Canadian just to survive. That's not just competition, that's dependence. 7 countries walked away from U.S. steel, but the 8th was America itself. This wasn't a trade war. No press conference. No breaking headlines. Just a quiet reshuffling. Canada didn't steal America's markets. It filled the void left by delay, division, and decay. In 2025, the world didn't cheer or jeer. It simply moved on. Steel is heavy. But trust? That's what really holds nations together. And today, that trust is shifting north.